He told her not to speak, just to save her breath for his name. And under those western stars, silence became the loudest kind of love. The night the river melted, a woman who had lost everything rode into a canyon where no one had spoken for years. There she met Eli Turner, a cowboy made of quiet and regret. When a storm nearly took his life, she saved him with nothing but her warmth and a whisper that would change them both forever. The wind came early that winter, dragging red dust off the canyon and throwing it against the cabin walls. By the time the sun went down, the air had turned sharp enough to cut. Inside, Eli Turner sat at his table, mending a torn saddle strap by lantern light. The only sound was the scrape of his knife, steady as breath. He liked it that way, quiet, predictable, unbothered. Silence was the one thing he could still trust. He'd been up here on the plateau nearly 5 years now, since the war ended and the rest of the world rode on without him. The Bureau paid him little to keep track of the wild horses running through the canyons, brand those that could be tamed, set loose the ones that refused. That was all right. He'd learned that a man didn't need more than a roof, a fire, and his own company if he wanted to keep from breaking. Near dusk, a lone rider appeared through the thin snow, coat torn, horse staggering. The man barely made it to the porch before sliding off the saddle. Eli caught him by the arm and dragged him inside, laid him near the fire. The rider pressed a crumpled envelope into Eli's palm. "Mail, from Moab," he rasped, coughing hard. "Stage lost in the storm. Keep it safe, won't you?" He drank a mouthful of water, then fell asleep where he lay. Eli set the envelope on the table. The name wasn't his. "To Miss Lydia Mayfield, care of the Northern Station." The Northern Station. That was here. His brow furrowed. Nobody sent mail to this place. Nobody even knew the name of the canyon unless they'd gotten lost inside it. He turned the envelope over, ready to toss it into the stove, but stopped when he saw the ink running faintly beneath the candlelight. "Arrival expected by first snowfall." He sat there long after the rider left at dawn, the letter still unopened beside his coffee tin. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, promising more snow. Somewhere in the valley, a herd of mustangs cried out, a wild, mournful sound that made the silence heavier. Eli rubbed his beard, uncertain whether to laugh or curse. A woman, sent here by letter. To this God-forsaken outpost. For what? He shoved his hat on and stepped outside, letting the cold bite through his shirt. Maybe she wouldn't come. Maybe the letter was old or sent wrong. The thought brought him a strange mix of relief and disappointment. He watched his breath curl into the wind, then muttered to the empty sky, "Don't nobody belong here but me." That night, the fire burned low. He tried to sleep, but couldn't. The letter lay on the table, whispering each time the draft moved it. In the middle of the night, he got up and poured himself coffee gone cold. He almost tore the letter open, then stopped again. It wasn't his place. And yet there was something about that handwriting, neat but trembling, like someone trying hard to keep from falling apart. The next morning he saddled up and rode down to the valley to check the traps. Snow had crusted over the sagebrush. The wind carried the smell of smoke from some far-off camp. Halfway down, he saw a hawk circling low, slow, as if keeping watch over something lost. He thought of the name again, Lydia Mayfield, and wondered what kind of woman would let herself be sent into this nowhere. A nurse? A widow? Maybe someone running from worse than the cold. When he came back at dusk, he built a fire and sat by it, the unopened letter between his hands. The walls creaked as the temperature dropped. He remembered his brother Sam, the way he used to hum while mending tack by the same firelight years ago, before the war took him, before silence became safer than speaking. The memory scraped against his ribs like a dull blade. He stood, shoved the letter into the drawer, and tried to forget. Days passed. The snow thickened. On the third morning, a far-off sound carried through the wind, a wagon wheel groaning, the faint jingle of harness bells. Eli stepped outside, eyes narrowing against the glare. A shape moved slowly along the ridge. A horse, a woman riding side saddle, wrapped in a coat too thin for the weather. Her face was half hidden by a scarf, but he could see the determination in the straightness of her back. She was heading straight toward his cabin. Eli stayed where he was, boots sinking into the snow. The wind whipped around them, tossing flakes into the air like ashes. When she finally stopped in front of him, she swung down without a word, hands trembling only slightly as she tied her reins. Her voice, when it came, was low, dry, and steady. "I'm Lydia Mayfield," she said. "You got my letter." Eli said nothing. He could feel the words pushing against his throat, but none came out. He just nodded once and stepped aside, opening the door. She hesitated, eyes flicking over the cabin, then met his gaze. Green, clear, too alive for this barren place. "I'm not here for company," she said quietly. "I'm here to work. And to breathe." Eli's jaw tightened. He gestured toward the fire. "Plenty of both in there," he muttered. She brushed past him, boots crunching on the wooden floor. The warmth swallowed her silhouette. Eli lingered on the threshold, looking at the tracks she'd left behind in the snow. Small, sharp, certain. Inside, Lydia set her worn satchel beside the table, pulled off her gloves, and began unwrapping her scarf. She looked around the room as if measuring it for what could still be lived in. The light from the lantern caught a glint of copper in her hair. Eli closed the door, the wind dying instantly behind him. For the first time in years, his cabin didn't sound empty. It sounded like the start of something he wasn't sure he wanted. The fire cracked, throwing a flare of light across her face. She met his eyes. "Mr. Turner," she said softly, "if you don't mind, I'll start by boiling some water." He gave a slow nod. The words felt strange in the room. Another voice filling a space that had only ever known his own silence. And as Lydia bent over the stove, her breath mingling with the steam, Eli turned toward the window. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft but certain, like a promise that could no longer be ignored. Steam rose from the kettle, curling into the cabin's rafters where the smoke always lingered before finding its way out. Lydia moved with careful precision, as though she'd lived there her whole life. She poured the boiling water into a tin basin, wiped the table clean with the edge of her sleeve, and began setting order to the small chaos. Every motion she made replaced something Eli had learned not to notice: dust, the smell of iron, the dull shine of glass once wiped clear. Eli watched from the doorway, still wearing his coat, hat shadowing his eyes. The habit of silence held him in place. He couldn't decide if he resented her for moving so easily through his space, or if he was startled by how naturally she seemed to belong there. She hadn't asked where to find things. She simply opened drawers, tested shelves, rearranged until the room itself breathed different. When she finally turned, her hands were red from the heat of the water, but her voice was calm. "You don't talk much." Eli's reply came slow. "Not much to say," That's a lie every man tells himself. She gave a faint smile, not mocking, just tired. He couldn't hold her gaze for long. The air between them was dense with something unspoken, like static before lightning. He took the saddle strap from the peg and sat down to work, the rhythm of his knife echoing faintly. Lydia moved toward the stove, humming under her breath, some tune he didn't recognize, soft and steady, the kind you'd hum to a frightened child. By late afternoon, the wind had calmed, and light spilled through the small window, catching dust in mid-air. Lydia had found a cloth, washed it, and hung it as a curtain. She stood back, inspecting it as if that thin fabric could keep the whole world out. Eli rose to fill the water bucket, his boots thudding across the floorboards. "That's mine," he said quietly, glancing at the curtain. She didn't turn. "It's ours now." The light was too harsh. He said nothing more, but the word ours stayed lodged in his mind like a burr under skin. That evening, they ate in silence. Lydia had found beans and dried meat, and somehow turned them into stew. Eli lifted the first spoonful with suspicion, tasted, and stopped. The flavor was unfamiliar, clean, with something sharp beneath it. Herbs, maybe. She didn't look up from her bowl, but her voice brushed the air between them. "You can say it's bad. I've heard worse." He shook his head. "It's good." The two words seemed to hang longer than intended. She nodded once and kept eating. Outside, the wind moaned down the canyon, but inside, the sound of 2 spoons touching tin bowls felt louder than any storm. When they finished, Lydia gathered the dishes, rinsed them with melted snow, and stacked them near the fire. Eli stood to hang his coat, then paused. She was kneeling by the hearth, face lit orange by the flames, her expression unreadable. There was a steadiness in her, the kind born from grief so deep it had burned itself quiet. He wanted to ask where she'd come from, why she'd chosen this forgotten corner of the desert. But the words refused to climb past his throat. So instead, he reached for another log, placed it on the fire, and the sparks jumped high, painting her cheek in gold. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked suddenly. "Of what?" "The quiet." Eli looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "The quiet's the only thing that don't leave." Lydia nodded, turning her eyes toward the flames. "You'll find it leaves too, if you let someone stay." Her tone was neither warning nor invitation, just truth spoken from somewhere far away. For the rest of the night, she said nothing more. She took her blanket, spread it near the opposite wall, and lay down with her back to him. The fire cracked, the clock on the shelf ticked faintly, and Eli sat at the table, watching the outline of her shoulder rise and fall with each breath. He didn't sleep. The smell of soap and wood smoke clung to the air, different from the musk of his solitude. In the faint lamplight, he could see the places she'd changed. The curtain. The pot moved closer to the fire, a tin cup placed upside down to dry. Small things. Ordinary things. But to him, they felt like signs that the life he'd built alone was shifting underfoot. Sometime before dawn, Lydia stirred. Her blanket slipped down, and she shivered in her sleep. Eli hesitated, then rose quietly, pulled another hide from the hook, and laid it gently across her. She didn't wake, only sighed, the tension in her shoulders easing. He stood there for a long time, staring at the curve of her hand resting near her face, roughened by years of work but still delicate against the rough floorboards. He turned back toward the dying fire. The logs had burned low, glowing red beneath the ash. Outside, the wind had dropped to a whisper. Eli poured the last of the coffee into a tin cup and drank, its bitterness grounding him. The dawn light crept through the curtain Lydia had hung, softening the room's edges. He realized, almost with alarm, that he didn't hate the change. When the first rays of sun reached the window, Lydia opened her eyes for a brief second. Confusion clouded her face, as if she'd forgotten where she was. Then she sat up, brushing hair from her eyes, and met his gaze across the room. Neither spoke. It was enough that they both understood the same thing. The silence between them had changed shape. It was no longer a wall, but a thread. Eli nodded once, a gesture small enough to vanish if she blinked. She gave a faint smile in return and rose to stoke the fire. As the flame caught, the room brightened. Outside, the snow glittered like shards of glass, and the horses neighed somewhere down the slope. Lydia poured water into the pot again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Another day," she said. "Let's not waste it." Eli pulled on his coat, stepped to the door, and opened it to the blinding morning. The cold rushed in, stinging his face, carrying with it the faint scent of something new, something alive. He looked back once more. She was standing near the hearth, sleeves rolled, eyes steady on the flame. The smallest nod passed between them before he stepped outside. Behind him, the door closed with a soft click, sealing the warmth inside. And for the first time in 5 winters, Eli Turner felt that when he returned, someone would still be there. The days found their rhythm without permission. Morning light spilled through the thin curtain Lydia had hung, softening the hard corners of the cabin. Eli rose before dawn, as he always had, but now the sound of another person moving inside the same 4 walls altered even the silence. There were 2 sets of footsteps on the floorboards, 2 breaths forming clouds in the cold. Sometimes she hummed while grinding coffee beans. Sometimes he caught himself listening. By midwinter, the canyon had frozen over, each morning a mirror of pale sky. Lydia learned the patterns of Eli's day, the way he whistled low to calm the horses, how he marked the fence posts with white chalk to count the weeks. She worked beside him when she could, mending blankets, boiling herbs, organizing the small storeroom until everything smelled faintly of cedar and soap. She never asked what he thought of her changes. He never asked why she needed to make them. It was enough that things were happening again. At first, he tried not to watch her, but it was impossible not to notice the way she'd pause before pouring water into a pot, waiting for the fire's hiss to rise, or how she tilted her head when listening to the horses stamping outside, as if their sounds filled her with calm. Eli realized she was the first person he'd seen in years who didn't treat silence as emptiness. She filled it with her hands, her breath, her quiet steadiness. And that began to unsettle him. One afternoon, he returned from the ridge to find the cabin open, wind swirling papers from the desk. Lydia was outside by the trough, sleeves rolled, rubbing a saddle blanket clean with icy water. Her fingers were red and raw. "You'll freeze," he said gruffly. She looked up, strands of hair plastered to her cheek. "It's worth the warmth after." There was a smudge of soap on her chin. For a moment he wanted to reach out and wipe it away, but he didn't move. He only turned back toward the barn, muttering, "Suit yourself." That night, the wind carried snow through the cracks again. Lydia sat by the fire, mending a torn glove. The needle glinted in her fingers, catching the orange light. Eli sharpened his knife. the rasp steady. Every few moments, she'd blow lightly to thread the needle, her breath soft and human. The room, once heavy with solitude, now throbbed with the small sounds of life. The scrape of metal, the whisper of thread, the hiss of firewood collapsing into ash. The cabin had never been so alive, and never so quiet. When she finished sewing, Lydia placed the glove beside his chair without a word. Her hand brushed the back of his for an instant. Warm and firm. It was a mistake, maybe, or maybe not. He didn't look up. The gesture lingered like the faint taste of something sweet he couldn't name. The following morning, he found her standing outside in the pale blue dawn, watching the frost climb the window panes. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Proof," she said simply, "that the world keeps turning, even when no one's watching." He didn't understand, but the way she said it made him wonder what she had lost to make her look for proof at all. Later that week, the horses grew restless. A storm was coming. Eli fixed the fence posts while Lydia hauled buckets of feed from the barn. She slipped once on the ice, the bucket spilling grain into the snow. Eli reached her just in time, catching her by the arm. For a heartbeat, her hand gripped his sleeve, and her eyes met his. Green, bright, startled. They stood like that, caught between apology and something they didn't yet have words for. Then she pulled free, laughing nervously. "You'll have me ruining your whole system," she said. "Wouldn't be the first thing ruined out here," he answered. That night, she baked cornbread with the last of the flour, the smell of it filling the cabin like a memory. Eli couldn't remember the last time he'd tasted anything made by another hand. He ate slowly, as if memorizing it. Lydia didn't watch him, but when he finally said, "It's good," her lips curved slightly, the smallest smile breaking through weeks of restraint. "Then we're even," she said. "You saved me from the ice." Outside, snow began again, tapping gently against the windows. Inside, the lamp flickered, throwing their shadows long and uneven across the walls. Lydia rose, gathered the plates, and brushed her hand across the table's rough wood. "You should sand this someday," she murmured. "It's full of splinters." Eli looked up. "So am I," he said. The words slipped out before he could stop them. For the first time, Lydia didn't have an answer. She just looked at him, really looked, as though seeing not the man but the ache beneath him. The storm pressed through the night, wind rattling the roof until the beams groaned. Eli sat awake long after Lydia had gone to her corner of the room. He watched the small shapes of her breathing beneath the blanket, steady and slow. The fire dimmed to embers. Somewhere in the dark, a horse neighed, low and uneasy. Eli stood, added wood to the fire, then looked back once more. She'd turned in her sleep, her face half lit, lips parted slightly. He caught himself whispering her name. Just once, barely sound at all, then swallowed it before it escaped the room. Morning came gray and still. The snow outside had sealed the world in white. Lydia woke to the smell of coffee already boiling. She sat up, hair loose around her face, eyes soft with sleep. "You're early," she said. "Didn't sleep," he replied. She nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. "Then let's make something of the morning." She moved about the cabin with quiet purpose, rearranging the tins, sweeping the hearth, humming that same tune. Eli watched her from the doorway again, realizing that she had brought more than warmth or work to his life. She had brought sound. Not loud, not constant, but small things. A humming, a sigh, a spoon against tin. The kind of sounds that make a place feel lived in. As she handed him a cup, their fingers brushed again, not by accident this time. He looked at her, and she didn't look away. The silence between them had a pulse now. Something alive and waiting. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, a man who'd forgotten speech and a woman who'd run from hers began to build something neither yet dared to name. The storm came without warning, rolling down from the cliffs in a wall of white. By midday, the air had gone still in that eerie way that always came before the worst of it. Eli was out beyond the ridge, checking the traps he'd left near the river, while Lydia waited by the window, her hands restless on the edge of the table. The wind began to rise, tugging at the roof seams, whispering along the boards. When she looked out again, he was gone, swallowed by snow. Hours passed. Dusk fell early, turning the light to silver. Lydia stepped onto the porch, the cold cutting straight through her shawl. "Eli," she called, but the sound vanished, eaten by the wind. She hesitated only a moment before throwing on her coat and stepping into the storm. The snow was knee-deep, her skirt dragging heavy, the world around her erased into a blur of white. Somewhere ahead, she thought she heard a horse cry, but it could have been the wind. She pressed forward until her breath burned. She found him near the river bend, slumped beside a half-frozen pool, his horse trembling nearby. The rope in his hand had iced over, his fingers blue. Lydia dropped to her knees, shaking him by the shoulder. His eyes flickered open but unfocused, his voice hoarse. "Didn't think it'd come so fast," he murmured. "Storm's early." She hooked her arm under his, heaved him upright with strength born from fear. "You're burning up," she said. "Move." The journey back was a blur, wind screaming, snow biting, each step a battle. By the time they reached the cabin, Eli could barely stand. Lydia dragged him inside, slammed the door against the wind, and fell to her knees beside the hearth. She stripped off his coat, boots, gloves, all soaked through, and threw them toward the fire. His skin was pale, lips cracked, breath shallow. "Stay awake," she ordered. He tried to answer, but the words came out as a cough. The night stretched long. Lydia built the fire high, fed him spoonfuls of warm water, pressed her hand to his forehead. His skin burned beneath her palm. "You're not dying here," she whispered. "Not in my house." He drifted in and out of fevered sleep, muttering names she didn't know. Sam, father, then silence. Each time his voice broke, she answered softly. "I'm here, Eli. It's all right. You're safe." By the second night, the fever worsened. He tossed in the bed, drenched in sweat. Eyes glazed. She soaked cloths in cool water, wiped his neck, changed the sheets, her hand steady though exhaustion clawed at her. When his shivering grew violent, she lay beside him under the same blanket, pressing her warmth into him, holding him through each wave of tremor. His breath hitched against her collarbone. She could feel his heartbeat stuttering, slowing, and then racing again. Sometime near dawn, the fire burned low, throwing long shadows on the walls. Lydia's body ached, but she refused to sleep. She sat upright beside him, tracing the rim of the tin cup in her lap. Eli stirred, eyes half open, lost somewhere between dream and waking. He reached out blindly, his fingers brushing her wrist. "Sam," he whispered. She caught his hand. "No," she said softly. "It's me." His brow furrowed. "You shouldn't be here." "I am," she said, "and I'm not leaving." He tried to smile, a faint, broken curve of his mouth. Then he breathed out, words rasping from somewhere deep inside. "Don't speak. Save your breath. For my name." It was barely sound, more breath than voice, but it froze her where she sat. The room seemed to hold still. The fire, the wind outside, her own pulse. She stared at him, the words sinking slow as falling ash. He was delirious, she told herself. He didn't know what he'd said. Yet when she looked at him, she saw something there. Recognition, even through the fever. She stayed beside him until morning, her fingers interlaced with his. When he woke, sunlight had returned to the world. The storm had passed, and the cabin glowed with a new brightness, like the earth after being buried and reborn. Eli blinked at her, dazed. "You're still here," he murmured. "Where else would I go?" she said. He tried to sit, failed, then gave a faint, rough laugh. "You're stubborn." "Someone had to be," she answered. "You'd have let the storm take you." He turned his head toward her, studying the tired lines around her eyes, the hair coming loose from her braid. "You shouldn't have risked it." She smiled faintly. "You shouldn't have gone out." Neither spoke after that. The silence between them had changed again. It was no longer wary or polite. It was heavy with what had nearly been lost. Lydia fed him broth in slow sips. When he was strong enough, he reached for her hand, not to stop her, but to keep her there. The firelight caught the edge of her sleeve, glowing amber. That evening, the world outside seemed impossibly calm. The snow lay smooth as silk over the hills. Eli sat propped on his pillow, watching Lydia tidy the room. "You didn't have to do all that," he said quietly. She glanced over her shoulder. "I did." He wanted to tell her he'd heard her voice through the fever, that it had been the only sound pulling him back, but the words stayed caught in his chest. Instead, he said, "You saved me." Lydia didn't turn. "No," she said softly. "We saved each other." Later, when she finally rested, her head drooping near the edge of the bed, Eli reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. It was a small thing, barely movement at all, but it felt like the beginning of something neither of them knew how to name. The fire had burned down to coals again, their red glow casting warmth over her sleeping form. Outside, the stars began to reappear, sharp, clear, endless. Eli closed his eyes and whispered her name once, testing it like a prayer. The sound of it felt like home. Morning light spilled through the window, thin and soft as silk. The world had turned quiet again, the snow outside untouched, the air so still that every sound inside the cabin seemed to echo. Eli Turner sat at the edge of the bed, the blanket still draped around his shoulders, breathing slow, testing the shape of his strength. Each breath came easier now. The fever had broken, leaving behind a hollow calm he couldn't name. Lydia moved about the room in that quiet, efficient way she had. Her hands never seemed to rest. Folding blankets, boiling water, sweeping the floor that didn't need sweeping. She didn't speak much since the storm. Eli caught her glancing at him sometimes, not to check his health, but as if unsure how to stand in a room where death had brushed so close, and then decided to pass. He watched her pour coffee into 2 tin cups. "You look better," she said, finally. "I feel worse," he answered with a faint smile. "You'll live." "Seems that way," he said. "Guess I owe you for that." She sat down across from him, the steam from her cup rising between them like a wall. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "People either show up when it matters or they don't." He wanted to ask who hadn't shown up for her, but something in her tone stopped him. Instead, he nodded toward the window. "Storm's cleared. You can see clear to the ridge." She followed his gaze. "It's beautiful," she said softly, but her voice held no joy, only weariness, the kind that doesn't fade with rest. Eli rose slowly, his legs uncertain beneath him. "You should get some sleep. You've been awake longer than I have." Lydia smiled faintly. "I don't sleep much." She reached for her satchel on the shelf, but as she lifted it, a small folded letter slipped out, sliding across the table. She froze. Eli bent to pick it up before she could. The envelope was thin, the edges worn soft, the handwriting precise and small. His name wasn't on it. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. Something about the way she stood there, rigid, eyes fixed on the floor, told him it wasn't a letter meant to be read aloud. Still, he held it a moment longer. "You dropped this." Her voice came barely above a whisper. "It's nothing. Just a habit." Eli hesitated, then set it back on the table. But later, when she went outside to fetch water, he saw it again. The faint words showing through the paper, the first line half legible in the light. "If I die here, please bury me near the creek." He stared at it for a long time, the fire snapping behind him. He wasn't a man who pried, yet the sight of that letter pulled at something in him he hadn't felt in years. Fear, maybe, or recognition. That someone else in this room had been planning to disappear, just as he once had. When Lydia returned, she found him still standing there. "You read it," she said flatly. "Only the first line," he answered. "Wasn't meant to. I shouldn't have left it out." He shook his head. "You meant to. Somewhere inside, you wanted someone to see it." She set down the bucket and leaned against the doorframe, eyes tired but sharp. "That letter was never for you." "Then who?" "For whoever finds me after." Her voice cracked on the last word. She turned away, but Eli crossed the room before he could stop himself. "You don't get to talk like that," he said, rougher than he meant to. "Not after what we just went through." Lydia gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think saving a life erases what came before it?" "No," he said. "But it gives you the chance to start again." She looked at him then. Really looked. "And what about you, Eli Turner? What did you start running from?" He didn't answer. The question landed like a stone in water, sinking deep. She waited, but the silence stretched too long, and she turned back to her work. He wanted to tell her about Sam, his brother, the war, the order that went wrong, but his throat locked around the words. Some truths were too old to move anymore. That evening, the sky blazed orange as the sun fell behind the ridge. Lydia stood on the porch, arms folded, eyes lost somewhere beyond the horizon. Eli joined her, still unsteady on his feet. "I wasn't supposed to stay this long," she said quietly. "When I came here, I thought I'd work, help, maybe disappear before anyone noticed." "You did more than that," he said. She turned toward him, her hair catching the dying light. "Maybe. But the truth is, I don't know where I belong anymore." The wind rose, gentle but cold. He wanted to reach for her hand, but instead he said, "You belong here tonight. That's enough for now." She nodded once and went inside, leaving him alone under the sky. When he followed later, the cabin glowed softly in the dark. Lydia had fallen asleep by the fire, her head resting on her arm, the letter still lying on the table beside her satchel. Eli looked at it again, then carefully slid it into the drawer where he kept his own half-forgotten things. An old compass, a rusted medal, a broken harmonica. It felt right there, among the ghosts. He sat down and watched her sleep. Every time she exhaled, the flame wavered and returned, like the rhythm of something that refused to end. Outside, a coyote cried somewhere in the valley, the sound long and lonely, but not empty. Eli leaned back, the ache in his chest deep but not painful. When Lydia stirred, her eyes fluttering open, she saw him watching. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. "Didn't want to." She smiled faintly. "You'll change your mind by morning." "Maybe," he said, voice low. "But not tonight." She drifted back into sleep, and Eli sat there until dawn began to touch the window. The drawer was closed, but he could still feel the weight of the letter inside it. Quiet, but alive. A reminder that both of them were learning, slowly, how to stay. The thaw came slowly, one brittle morning at a time. Icicles shrank from the eaves, and the river below the ridge began to move again, dark water showing through seams of white. The wind softened, trading its sharp winter edge for something almost tender. Eli Turner felt the shift in his bones before he saw it. His joints ached less. His steps no longer echoed quite the same. The world was loosening. He woke early, stirred by a sound he hadn't heard in weeks. Hooves striking the frozen ground outside the cabin. For a moment, he thought it was the echo of a dream, but then he heard it again. 3 beats, then a stumble, then silence. Pulling on his coat, he opened the door. The sky was pale with dawn. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a horse, mud-caked, one ear torn, flank streaked with dried blood. "Ash," Eli breathed, the name falling from memory. The horse lifted its head at the sound, black mane rippling in the wind. It was the same wild Mustang he'd tried to break last summer, the one that had bolted into the canyons and vanished. Somehow, through storms and snow, it had found its way back. But this time, it was limping. Lydia appeared behind him, pulling her shawl tight. "Yours?" "He was," Eli said. "Looks like he's not anyone's anymore." Without another word, she stepped into the clearing, moving slow and steady, hands open. The horse tensed but didn't run. She murmured something low, a rhythm of sound rather than words. Eli watched, astonished, as the animal stilled under her voice. When she reached him, Ash lowered his head, nostrils flaring. Lydia's hand brushed its neck. "He's scared," she said quietly. "But he came back." Eli took the bridle from the porch rail, approached with care, and slipped it over the horse's head. Ash trembled, but allowed it. Up close, the wound on his leg looked bad, a deep gash crusted with ice and mud. "He'll need cleaning," Lydia said, already kneeling. She opened her satchel, drew out a strip of linen, a small bottle of salve, and a calm that seemed to still even the wind. For hours, they worked together. Lydia washed the wound while Eli held the reins. The horse shivered, but didn't fight. The smell of blood mixed with pine resin and cold air. Eli watched her hands. Quick, certain, gentle. "You've done this before," he said. "I used to tend soldiers," she replied. "They kick harder." He smiled, despite himself. "Guess I owe you twice now." "You can stop keeping count," she said. "That's not how this works." When it was done, Ash stood quietly, the bandage white against his dark coat. Lydia stepped back, wiping her hands on her skirt. "He'll live," she said. Eli nodded. "So will we." The words slipped out before he meant them. Lydia looked up, her eyes catching the morning light. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she turned away, brushing snow from her sleeves. "Let's get him fed," she said softly. They led the horse to the corral behind the cabin. Ash limped but followed without protest. Eli had built the fence years ago, never thinking he'd see another creature inside it. Now, as the horse settled near the trough, the place looked different, less like a cage, more like a refuge. Lydia leaned on the rail, her breath clouding the air. "He reminds me of someone," she said. Eli raised an eyebrow. "Who's that?" "Someone who ran too far, for too long." He didn't ask which one of them she meant. Over the next few days, the snow melted faster. Water dripped from the roof in slow rhythm, filling the silence that used to stretch unbroken. Ash grew stronger, his steps surer. Lydia brushed his coat each morning, humming that same tune he'd heard in her first week. Eli joined her sometimes, fixing the harness or patching the stable roof while she worked beside him. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. One evening, he found her standing in the fading light, staring at the mountains. "He'll run again soon," she said. "You'll have to let him go." Eli leaned against the post. "Maybe he'll stay." She shook her head. "Wild. Things don't stay. They only visit." He studied her profile, the calm set of her jaw, the faint sadness behind it. "You planning to leave too?" She didn't answer right away. "Maybe. I came here thinking I'd vanish quietly, but every day I stay it feels harder to imagine walking away." Eli said nothing. He reached for the brush in her hand and began running it down Ash's back. The strokes were slow, steady. "Then don't imagine it," he said. The days grew longer. The ice on the river broke, and patches of brown earth appeared like new skin. Lydia planted a few herb seeds in the thawed ground beside the porch. Eli mended the barn door. Life crept back in, not in grand ways, but through small acts that meant something only to the two of them. One morning, Ash stood at the fence, restless. The bandage had come loose. He pawed the ground, nostrils flaring. Lydia walked out, hands tucked into her shawl. "He's ready," she said. Eli watched as she unlatched the gate. The horse hesitated, looked at them once, then bolted toward the open valley. Snow burst beneath his hooves, the sun flashing off his coat. In moments he was gone, a streak of life cutting through the emptiness. Eli exhaled. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "Wild things don't stay." Lydia turned toward him. "No," she said. "But sometimes they come back." He looked at her then, the woman who had walked out of nowhere, who had saved his life and stitched herself into it without meaning to. "You talking about the horse?" he asked. She smiled faintly. Maybe. That night they sat outside by a small fire. The stars came out, sharp and clear, the air smelling of wet earth and smoke. Lydia held her cup close, eyes on the flames. Do you ever miss it? She asked. The noise of people, the towns, the music. Eli shook his head. Noise has never done much for me. She glanced at him, a spark of humor in her eyes. Then what does? He thought a moment. The sound of small things. Like what? Coffee boiling, hooves on dry ground. You breathing? Her eyes softened. You're learning to talk again. Not yet, he said. Just remembering how. They sat until the fire burned low. The night wrapped around them like a quiet promise. Beyond the ridge, a lone horse's cry carried through the dark. Lydia tilted her head, listening. That's him, she said. Ash. Eli smiled faintly. He knows the way home. For a long while, neither spoke. The stars above seemed closer than ever, their light falling gently across the cabin, the corral, and the two figures sitting side by side, two wild souls who had run far enough to find rest at last. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, quiet and deliberate, the way forgiveness does. The snow retreated from the ridge, inch by inch, revealing dark soil and old tracks beneath. The air changed first. It carried the scent of thawing pine and wet stone. When Lydia stepped outside that morning, the sound struck her, the slow, sure whisper of running water. The river had broken through the ice. The world was waking again. Eli was splitting logs near the barn, shirt sleeves rolled, the first sweat of the season glistening on his neck. He looked up when she called his name, and for a moment they simply stood there, two people caught between what had been survived and what might still come. Lydia smiled faintly. You hear it? He tilted his head. The sound of water drifted up the valley, steady as a heartbeat. Yeah, he said. Couldn't hear that for months. It's a good sound, she said. It means work, he replied, but there was a softness in his voice. They spent the morning hauling the last of the firewood down to the shed, their movements easy now. Practiced. Lydia had begun to laugh sometimes. Not often, but enough to surprise them both. She laughed that morning when Eli slipped on the thawing mud and swore under his breath. He looked at her, half grinning, half embarrassed, and said, You sound different when you laugh. How's that? Alive. The day warmed until they shed their coats. By noon, Lydia brought water from the creek. It ran cold and clear, alive with light. Eli knelt to fill the buckets beside her, their reflections bending together in the ripples. I forgot it could look like this, she said. Like what? Like something worth staying for. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She could feel it in the way his silence had changed. No longer a barrier, but a place she was welcome to rest inside. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the river from a distance. It moved fast now, cutting through what had once been frozen still. Lydia set her cup down and spoke without looking at him. I used to live near water, the Mississippi. It ran so wide you couldn't see the other side. I thought leaving it would make it easier to forget everything I'd lost. Eli waited. She went on, her voice low. My son used to play by that river. He died during the fever. I thought if I went far enough, the sound of running water wouldn't hurt anymore. But it still does. Eli turned toward her. The sunset threw a wash of amber across her face, catching the faint shimmer of tears she didn't bother to hide. He didn't reach for her. He just said quietly, "Then maybe it's not the water's fault." She looked at him then. Really looked. And for the first time since arriving, she didn't see a man hiding from the world. She saw someone standing in it, steady enough for her to lean against. The next day, they rode down to the lower pastures. The land there had begun to green, fragile shoots pushing through the soil. Lydia bent to touch them. "It's strange," she said. "All this life coming out of nowhere?" Eli shook his head. "Not nowhere. It's been waiting under the ice." They worked together through the afternoon, repairing the fence and clearing brush. When the sun began to fall, the light turned golden and soft. Lydia brushed the dirt from her hands, watching the river's shimmer in the distance. "When I first came here, I thought this place would bury me," she said. "And now?" he asked. "Now it feels like it's teaching me how to breathe again." Eli leaned on the post beside her. "You planning on staying long enough to learn?" She smiled, the kind that came from somewhere deep and hard-won. "If you'll have me." He didn't trust words much, so he answered the only way he knew. He reached for the small bundle of rope in his hand, cut a short length, and tied it around the fence rail where they stood. "What's that for?" she asked. "Marking where you said that," he replied. That night, they ate by the fire. The air was soft, heavy with the scent of wet earth. Lydia watched the flames dance and said, "When you were sick, you told me not to speak. Save your breath for my name, you said." Eli looked up, startled. "You remember that?" "I couldn't forget it if I tried." He hesitated. "Did you ever use it?" Her eyes met his. "Every time I breathed after that." The words hung between them, bright as sparks. Neither moved. Then Eli reached across the table, fingers brushing hers. It wasn't a declaration. It was a question answered without sound. Outside, the river kept running, loud enough now to drown the quiet that had once ruled their lives. Later, when the fire burned down and they stepped out onto the porch, Lydia looked up at the sky. The stars were out again, sharp as glass. "I used to think peace meant silence," she said. "Now I think it means sound, soft, steady, alive." Eli nodded. "Like the river." "Like us," she said. He turned to her. "Then don't go anywhere." She smiled faintly. "Wasn't planning to." The moon rose over the ridge, pale and full. The air between them hummed with something that didn't need naming. The river below kept moving, carrying away what winter had left behind. Eli reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. They stood like that for a long while, listening to the water, the night, their own quiet hearts. The thaw had come for the land. And for them too. The days grew long again, spilling light deep into the valley. Spring had taken hold in earnest, turning every ridge green and soft. The river ran fat and shining now, fed by meltwater from the peaks. Eli built a new fence along the upper meadow, while Lydia tended her herb garden near the porch. Life had settled into a quiet rhythm, steady, unhurried, and full in ways neither of them had expected. In the evenings, they would sit outside with mugs of coffee, the air thick with the scent of wild sage. Sometimes Lydia read from one of the old books she'd found in Eli's trunk, its pages warped from damp, its words worn, but still breathing. Sometimes he just listened, eyes fixed on the distance, where the sun sank into the canyons like an ember dropping into ash. They didn't need to fill the silence anymore. It spoke for them. One late afternoon, a wind came down from the north, carrying a hint of dust. Lydia looked up from her garden, watching the horizon. "Storm?" she asked. Eli shook his head. "Just the world remembering where it's been." He hammered the last post into place, straightened, and wiped his brow. When he turned, he found Lydia leaning against the porch rail, the light behind her, hair caught in the wind. She looked different in the sun, stronger, softer. The woman who had arrived broken by grief had been replaced by someone alive again. "You planning to build fences forever?" she teased. "Someone's got to keep the world in one piece. You think it's falling apart?" He looked at her and smiled. Small, but certain. Not today. That night, the sky turned clear as glass. 1,000 stars hung over the canyon, sharp enough to pierce the dark. Lydia lay back on the porch boards, a blanket under her. Eli joined her, stretching out beside her, boots crossed, hands behind his head. For a long time, neither spoke. The air smelled of rain that never came. "I used to wish on stars," she said finally. "When I was a girl, it never worked." "What did you wish for?" She smiled faintly. "The same thing every child does. To be loved enough that it doesn't hurt anymore." Eli turned his head. "Did it come true?" "I'm here, aren't I?" she whispered. He reached over, fingers brushing hers. "Then maybe it did." Above them, the Milky Way stretched in a long, pale river. Lydia closed her eyes. "You know," she said softly, "you still haven't told me what you wished for." Eli chuckled under his breath. "I stopped wishing a long time ago." "Then start again," she said, her voice almost a dare. He was quiet for a while, the night pressing close. Then he leaned toward her, so close she could feel his breath against her ear. "Don't speak," he murmured. "Save your breath for my name." Her eyes opened slowly. The stars burned above, steady and silent. She didn't answer, only turned toward him, her hand resting against his chest where his heart beat beneath the worn cotton. The rhythm matched the pulse of the world around them. River, wind, life. They stayed like that, neither speaking, until the chill crept in. Lydia sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "You ever wonder what happens when all this ends?" she asked. Eli looked toward the mountains. "It doesn't end. It changes shape." She nodded, her gaze following his. "Like us." The next morning, they rose early. Mist curled over the fields, and the horses grazed quietly along the ridge. Lydia brought warm bread to the table, while Eli mended a broken bridle. "You never told me what made you stay," she said. He glanced up. "You did." "That can't be true." "It's enough truth for me." Later they rode out together, following the river's edge until the land opened into a wide stretch of grass. The air shimmered with heat. Lydia slowed her horse, looking out at the horizon. "You ever think about going back? To town? To people?" Eli shook his head. "I've already found what I was looking for." She smiled. "You didn't even know you were looking." "Guess I do now." They stopped near the creek, where the water ran clear over smooth stones. Lydia dismounted first, kneeling to fill her canteen. When she looked up, Eli was standing over her, sunlight in his hair, a quiet warmth in his eyes. "What?" she asked. He knelt too, the old creak of his knees breaking the silence. "I used to think solitude made a man stronger," he said, "but it just made me empty. You changed that." Lydia reached for his hand. "Then we're even." The sky darkened by late afternoon. Thunder grumbled somewhere far away, but the storm never came. They rode back under streaks of orange and violet. At the cabin, Eli built a fire, though the night was mild. Lydia sat close, watching the flames. "We should plant something more permanent," she said. "Not just herbs. Maybe a garden." Eli nodded. "Tell me what it needs." "Patience? Water? A reason to stay." He smiled. "We've got all three." As the night deepened, the sound of crickets rose from the fields. Lydia rested her head against his shoulder. "You think people like us get another chance?" Eli thought for a long time before answering. "We just did." Outside, the stars shimmered over the valley. The cabin glowed faintly, a single point of light in a vast sea of darkness. The river whispered below, steady and sure. Lydia lifted her head, her lips close to his ear. "I don't think I've ever felt so quiet inside," she said. "That's how peace sounds," he murmured. She smiled and reached for his hand. "Then promise me something." "What's that?" "When the world gets loud again, when the storms come back, just say that line. So I remember this." He nodded once, eyes soft. "Don't speak," he said. "Save your breath for my name." Her smile trembled, and she pressed her forehead against his. The firelight caught the corner of her eye, turning it gold. The rest of the world faded. No past, no fear, only the sound of two hearts keeping time under the western stars. Outside, a wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the scent of rain and new beginnings. Eli and Lydia stayed by the fire until dawn painted the horizon pale blue. When the first bird called, she turned toward him, whispering something he almost didn't catch. "You were right," she said. "It doesn't end. It just changes shape." He smiled, the lines at his eyes deepening. "And this shape suits me fine." The sun rose over the ridge, washing the cabin in light. The garden beside the porch shone with dew. In the distance, a horse cried out. A wild sound, fierce and alive. Lydia looked up, eyes shining. "Ash," she said. Eli nodded. He found his way back. They stepped outside together, the morning spreading open before them. The air was cool, sweet, full of promise. Eli took her hand, and they walked toward the corral. The horse stood there, waiting. Above them, the sky stretched wide and endless, the stars fading one by one into daylight. The world was still turning, still alive. And for once, neither of them was running from it. If this story stayed with you, tell me what part you felt the most. Leave a comment, share it with someone who still believes love can come late, and subscribe so you won't miss the next tale under these western stars.